This video is sponsored by Ides of March. More about their Warhammer 40k major event later on. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and it's time for another episode of the best armies in Warhammer 40k, the weekly video series where we go through undefeated results from the last week of competitive play. And in this case, we see a huge development of the metagame with many large-scale majors going down this week. That includes the US Open Palm Springs, as well as the Texas Open. And as we can see, moving on to a metagame breakdown, there is a migration of the meta towards some top factions. Those should not be super shocking to you because, unsurprisingly, Ultramarines, with their massive amounts of new updates, got the most, had the most wins this weekend. They not only went undefeated at the Texas Open 2026, they didn't quite get to first place. They ended up losing on tiebreakers to Dark Angels. However, they went 6-0 at that event. Also winning the Battle for Toad Hall, Loch and Load, GT3, and going undefeated at the Iberian Open War Games Maguire. Now, we saw a lot of Spanish events this weekend, and one of them was the 4th Iberian Ham, which was won by Necrons, who also took down the Conquest Showdown for 2 undefeated results. And we saw a massive result from Tau Empire this week, who topped 2 of the larger events of the weekend, those being the Denver 40k Fight Club January Open, as well as the Palm Springs Open, the largest event of the weekend. Huge results for Tau this week. However, many other Space Marine chapters also did well. We see basically a huge diversity of different Space Marine factions doing pretty well. That includes Dark Angels winning the Texas Open 2026, Salamanders going undefeated at the Iberian Open at War Games Maguire, and Deathwatch winning the 2-Table to Talk GT, as well as Blood Angels at the 4th Iberian Ham. From there, we see a smattering of other factions doing well. That includes the Leagues of Votann at the Glasshammer GT January, Astra Militarum at Hammer in the New Year, Chaos Demons with Scintillating Legion at Akron Brew Brawl Winter GT, Thousand Suns at the Skovd Battleforge 6, Orks winning Coastal Assault with a very cool Mordaka list that I'm excited to talk about, and Adepta Sororitas at the First Blood CDMX, and last but certainly not least, Drukhari with a Spectacle of Spite winning the Denver 40k Fight Club January Open. So with that, let's get into these lists just after a word from our sponsor. This video is sponsored by the Ides of March, which, in addition to being a date, is also the date for a Warhammer 40k and AOS GT. Ides of March is a multi-game event held every year in Central March at the gorgeous Samoset Resort in Rockport, Maine. This event venue features stunning views and an absolutely incredible locale, and you can enjoy those views while playing Warhammer 40k. The event will feature not only a 100-player Warhammer 40k major, but also a similar-sized event for Age of Sigmar, as well as events for Blood Bowl and Star Wars Shatterpoint. Not to mention, it's also featuring a painting competition for those who are more hobby inclined. I'll be there live streaming the event, so I'll see you there as well, as long as you head down to the links in the video description or hit the QR code on screen to get your tickets to the Ides of March today. And I'll see you there March 13th through 15th, 2026. So we're going to start with our metagame frontrunner, the Ultramarines, by moving over to the Iberian Open War Games Maguire, which was taken down by Space Marines, with Ultramarines taking 2nd place with an undefeated record thanks to tiebreakers. And piloting them at the event was Antonio Mejias, who was running a Gladius task force. Now, his list looks very similar to a Blade of Ultramar list. It is focusing on very resilient, difficult-to-kill heavy units, things like Dreadnoughts and the Wardens of Ultramar, but he was playing it in Gladius task force. In this case, he was playing Captain Sicarius, the Artificer Armor Gravis Captain, who's extremely difficult to kill, a Combi Lieutenant for some utility, as well as Marneus Galgar and Uriel Ventress. We do have attachments for most of these characters. That includes 2 units of Victrix Honor Guard, 1 unit of 6, as well as a unit of 3. Those will attach a combination of Captain Sicarius as well as Marneus Calgar. And then we have Uriel Ventress, who can jump into a company hero squad to project his command point tax aura. On top of that, that's being backed up by a bunch of heavy vehicles. We do have an Assault Intercessor squad, as well as a standard intercessor squad just for some utility. We have 1 unit of jump pack assault intercessors, as well as the Wardens of Ultramar. These guys, we talked about them over the last couple of iterations because they are an incredibly efficient wounds pool. For 90 points, you get 20 wounds at toughness 4, a lot of whom have an invulnerable save, and you can embark into transports like Pulsars. Now, we don't have any Impulsors in this case, however, we are taking a pair of Redemptor Dreadnoughts as well as a pair of Ballistus Dreadnoughts. So, we are focusing on those big, heavy, tough Dreadnought profiles, not so much on the faster transport or battle tank varieties of this Gladius Task Force Blade of Ultramar sort of build. Instead, we are going to be focusing on those well-rounded defensive profiles, so the Ballistus and the Redemptors can kind of play as a front line of defense. You can then follow up anything that goes to destroy them with the Victrix Honor Guard. You're presenting basically a full army of 2+ armor saves. You then have to get through the Victrix Honor Guard through Cato Sicarius's, or Captain Sicarius, I should say, the original Sicarius versions, Scout, Assault, and Reactive Move. You have to deal with him, then have to deal with Marnius Calgar through his -1 to wounded, and then also, lastly, Uriel Ventress. Most armies don't have the capacity to get through all of those 2+ saves, in addition to 4 Dreadnoughts making up the sort of bulk of the army, and so it's going to be able to attrition out a ton of enemies for that reason. Pretty interesting build, a little different than we typically see, but a lot of the same staples we've been seeing for Ultramarines throughout the last couple of weeks. Now, with that, we're going to move over to the 4th Iberian Ham, which was won by Geary, playing Necrons and making use of some of the new profiles coming out of 500 Worlds for the new Catan shards. Now, Geary here was playing in a Star Shatter arsenal. This is an interesting detachment and has almost no synergy with monster profiles like the Catan shards, but not entirely zero. We are taking a Catan shard of the Deceiver as well as one of the Void Dragon, importantly, none of the Nightbringer. However, the Deceiver is fairly useful with the big heavy vehicles and things that we are running with this particular build. We're taking a single Technomancer with Chrono Impedance Fields, as well as a Canoptic Wraith unit. From there, we have a unit of 3 Canoptic Scarabs for utility. Nice thing is that these guys can hang out near the Technomancer and get an OC value, which then allows them to perform actions and perform a lot of utility duties. So as long as they can stay inside that 6-inch Canoptic control node zone, they're going to be able to chain out to central objectives in order to control them or to score secondaries on them. We do have a unit of 6 Canoptic Wraiths for him to hop into, as well as heavy support from 2 Doomsday Orks, and a bunch of utility in the form of a Tombblade unit, 2 units of 5-flayed ones, as well as the Locust Destroyers. The cool thing here is that the Doomsday Orks can be very difficult to deploy, so one thing that we can do is use the Catan shard of the Deceiver and his reposition ability, his redeployment ability, to either deploy them aggressively, force your opponent to deploy extremely defensively, and then just pull out of line of sight before the first turn roll-off, or you can do the opposite, where you deploy up in a position where you could potentially get the shot on your opponent if you do end up going first. Obviously, you don't know necessarily if you are going to go first, but it allows you much more flexibility on placing the Doomsday Ark and the Silent King. A big downside of Star Shatter Arsenal and these builds that focus entirely on Doomsday Arks and dealing damage with them is that oftentimes your opponent can sort of deploy around where they're going to be able to maneuver because they are so physically large, and that allows them to prevent shots from those things on the early turns of the game. However, you can force your opponent to deploy suboptimally by using the redeployment from the Catan shard of the Deceiver. Now, the other thing that's interesting here is the reactive move that this army can perform after your opponent shoots at a non-Titanic unit from your army. For a command point, you can reactive reposition to move D6 inches. That allows you to position the Catan shards farther up the table in some cases if they are going to be in threat range, which allows you to extend their movement slightly. You could also alternatively prevent enemies from getting a lot of attacks into them, multiple activations into them by hiding them. And given that especially the Deceiver is so physically small, unlike units like the Doomsday Arks, it is actually kind of easy to hide that guy with a D6 move, unlike a larger unit like a big vehicle, for example. In addition to that, you can also use Endless Servitude at the end of your own fight phase to reanimate these guys. So you have the opportunity to reanimate 2d3 over the course of a battle round, plus repair them with a Technomancer as well. So the amount of regeneration available to them is actually fairly high in Star Shatter Arsenal, and they're going to get some benefit from the detachment ability. They can get around -1 hit effects if they target something on an objective marker. Not the biggest thing in the world, but occasionally useful, especially since they don't bracket. So there's not too many situations where getting +1 to hit is hugely relevant for them. But still an interesting inclusion, and definitely has some unique play in Starchatter Arsenal builds. And I think goes to show you how strong these datasheets are, that they are being taken in detachments that aren't explicitly designed to run them. So that moves us on to armies that had single undefeated results this week, and fortunately Space Marines had a lot of those, with several different chapters doing fairly well, and that returns us to the Iberian Open Wargames Maguey, where Fernando Martin Avalos went undefeated with a Forge Fathers Seekers army from Salamanders. This is the Salamanders specific detachment that resembles a Firestorm assault force, and I've actually talked quite a bit about on the channel this week. I released a Salamanders Getting Started video where I talked at length about this detachment a couple of weeks ago. You can go check that out on the channel. I'll link it in the video description if I remember. In this list, we are running Adrex Agatone, a combi weapon lieutenant, as well as Vulcan Heston as all of the characters. And this list is actually particularly interesting because it's focusing very heavily on the use of transports, and especially Land Raiders, but maybe not the one that you would expect. We're also rocking an Assault Intercessor squad plus a standard Intercessor squad. The Assault Intercessor squad is the likely attachment option for Vulcan Heston, since they give him wound rerolls for his now devastating sword attack, and then an Intercessor squad for the backline. We have one unit of Jump Pack Assault Intercessors for utility. The nice thing there is that they get a Hand Flamer on their Sergeant. Same thing with Assault Intercessors, so they can actually benefit from the Vulcan's Forge Father ability to get rerolls on Flamer weapons and actually contribute a little bit of extra damage, which is kind of sweet. We then have a Blade Guard veteran squad that's for Adrex to hop into, that largely just unlocks his attachment ability. The Blade Guard veterans can give him reroll once they hit, and then he can give the unit reroll all wound rolls, and they can hit like an absolute truck. We have two Eradicator squads for some additional close range shooting. The detachment ability brings them up to strength 10 on their Meltas, which is nice, and then they'll get full hit and wound rerolls, and Assault to get closer and into that Melta range with their Total Obliteration ability. We have a single Impulsor to carry some of these smaller units around the battlefield, 3 units of Infernus Marines, as well as an Invader ATV for utility. We have a midboard presence in the form of a Redemptor Dreadnought, a scout squad for some forward operation, as well as a single Storm Speeder Hammer Strike to knock cover off of enemies. The nice thing here as well is that the Melted Destroyer on the Hammer Strike will benefit from Vulcan's reroll effect, and also go to strength 10 if you're within 12 inches of your target. So the Storm Speeder Hammer Strike, in addition to smaller Melta attacks, for example, the multi-Melta on the Invader ATV, can by themselves actually knock out some heavier targets, while the Hammer Strike puts its missile launchers or its grenade launchers into stripping cover from enemies for lower AP weapons. Now, what lower AP weapon could we be discussing? It could be one of the 2 Land Raiders in the list. Godhammer pattern Land Raiders, equipped with the 4 Las Cannon Sponson attacks. So, the nice thing here for these guys is that they are going to gain assault from the detachment, while you aren't always in close range to get the +1 strength with the Las Cannon attacks. That allows you to reposition around terrain much more easily. Now, it seems like this would be an odd choice because we don't have a ton of big units that we would want to put into the Land Raiders. However, we have so many smaller squads that these Land Raiders can really act as an aircraft carrier that you can basically ferry all of these little units around. For example, each Land Raider could take an Eradicator squad, which takes up 6 transport capacity, in addition to one of the Infernus squads, which takes up an additional 5 transport capacity and leaves them with 1. That allows you to do things like react and move your Combi Lieutenant into the Land Raider if you need to, and it gives you options to use Burning Vengeance when enemies attack the Land Raider to hop out either one of those units, where you can then react into infantry with your Infernus Marines or into vehicles with your Eradicators. The Land Raiders can also then act as pretty good delivery systems for those units. So we have a ton of different transport options, whether or not the Impulsor is going to be taking some of those Infernus shots into its own firing deck to deliver them. That is a Shield Dome Impulsor, by the way, so it is a little bit more defensive than the traditional Sky Talon array variety. Or we can also just be delivering them with the standard Land Raiders as well, just moving them forward their 10 inches and disembarking into important areas of the table. The nice thing, too, is that the Infernus Marines get the ability to shoot and perform actions, so if the Land Raiders are trundling forward, they can disembark out in front of them for additional movement, and then the Infernus squad can do things like recover assets and also fire their flamers. You can also charge when coming out of the Land Raider, so while we can also deliver lure things like Adrax's unit into melee from the Land Raider itself, we could alternatively be charging those Infernus Marines onto opposing objectives. The Infernus Marines get OC2 from Vulcan Heston, so they're actually fairly good at taking objectives. And now you're just bullying the middle of the table with two relatively inexpensive T12 2+ save profiles that can all react with the Infernus Marines or Eradicators that are hiding within them. Pretty interesting list, and it's cool to see this style of army take shape, especially Land Raider focused. Forgefather Seekers, I do like the long range guns in addition to the assault given by the detachment, because it allows the Land Raiders to operate with an inconsistent threat range, so your opponent can never really play around where they could potentially have line of sight, and that forces them to deploy and maneuver a little bit inefficiently, because at any point if a Land Raider rolls a 6, gets a line of sight into an oath target, for example, that maybe your opponent wasn't expecting, they could randomly knock things out, especially the capacity of the Stormspeeder Hammer Strike to move so quickly, or Deep Strike to clip cover off of enemies. You get +1 to hit, full rerolls from the Godhammer las cannons. You can put 4 las cannon shots fairly reliably into a lot of heavy targets and randomly kill stuff, which means your opponent has to play scared the entire time of the weird threat ranges of these Land Raiders. Really cool list. You love to see lists like this doing well, and obviously as a big fan of Forgefather Seekers and Salamanders in general, I'm excited to see it at 5-0. Now, with that, we are moving over to the second largest event of the weekend, the Texas Open 2026, which almost beat out the US Open Palm Springs, the official Warhammer event, as a major level event this weekend. However, I think it was down by like 11 players or something. Otherwise, it would have been larger. This ended up being won by Cam Hawkins, who was playing Dark Angels. Cam was playing a Wrath of the Rock detachment for -1 to be wounded on his infantry. A couple weeks ago, I released a Getting Started video for Dark Angels where I talked about Wrath of the Rock pretty extensively, and I've even talked about a more mounted variety of Wrath of the Rock, which is in fact what this list was bringing. So in this case, it does give you -1 to be wounded if the strength is higher than your toughest characteristic for infantry and also mounted units, and most of the stratagems are useful on mounted units as well. So it has basically equal utility in both of those varieties. And the mounted units in Raven Wing are relatively difficult to kill. They have baked in invulnerable saves and high toughness characteristics. So you can act as kind of a midboard presence with them and then counterattack with your other characters and your late game units, which works very similar to a Deathwing style of this detachment, which you typically see focusing on units like Deathwing Knights. However, it's faster, it does more damage with shooting, it's good if you are susceptible to plasma fire, which is good for a lot of things like Victrix Honor Guard, for example. Heavy infantry will go down to massed plasma shots pretty well. And that is what we're talking about today. So this list was bringing Asriel, a Terminator Chaplain with Deathwing Assault, so he can drop in turn 1 out of Deep Strike in your movement phase. We have a Combo Weapon Lieutenant, Lionel Johnson, as well as a Raven Wing Command Squad, an Assault Intercessor Squad, 1 Standard Intercessor Squad, in addition to 5 Deathwing Knights to attach with the Chaplain, an Invader ATV. The cool thing about the Invader here as well is that it can occasionally counterfire if you shoot at nearby mounted units, and this army is focused so heavily on mounted units that unlike normal Invader ATV play, where they're usually running around being utility units, there are so many mounted in this list that you might actually get to use that. We then have a single Outrider squad for utility and a little bit of disruption, especially with Tactical Mastery to allow them to advance, shoot, and charge. They can run up and apply their 2 damage melee attacks on the charge fairly effectively. We then have a total of 18 Ravenwing Black Knights. Only 1 attachment for them. We're only running the single Ravenwing Command Squad with no enhancements. However, we do have the maximum number of Ravenwing Black Knights, all of those equipped with Plasma Talons. We can increase the strength of those with Weapons of the Dark Age, which is nice to bring them up to strength 10, so they can do some serious damage. And then we can get +1 to wound on those shots with a Stormspeeder Thunder Strike to clear out vehicles with massed plasma fire. Very, very cool list, and I'm excited to see lists like this do well because it's a cool archetype. It's difficult to play because mounted units tend to be kind of tough. In the current iteration of Warhammer 40k, they are very difficult to get a lot of use out of because they can't go through walls, so it's difficult to position them. However, in this case, we're actually running a dearth of attachment options for them, which actually shrinks the size of the unit and makes them easier to maneuver. And then, obviously, you do have a lot of benefits in Wrath of the Rock. You have, for example, the ability to be -1 to be wounded from the detachment ability, a Feel No Pain, or an invulnerable save from the Ravenwing Command Squad. You can protect yourself against mortals with the Lion nearby, and then if you lose a couple of models, the Ravenwing Command Squad can start to regenerate those models back from his unit, so you can play a little bit more aggressively with them and dissuade your opponent from attacking you, which is very cool. Very nice to see an army like this doing well. I love to talk about these lists. congratulations to Cam Hawkins for winning that big old event. Now, moving on from there, we also saw Deathwatch doing pretty well. It's another Space Marine chapter at the Two-Tabled to Talk GT. Blake Chandler took this one down at 5-0 using a Black Spear Task Force and took a lot of standard inclusions that we see in many Black Spear Task Force builds. However, with a greater focus on Deathwatch veterans. Now, this list in particular was running a Gravis Armored Captain with Tome of the Ectoclades. That's to give a discounted site-to-site teleport or special issue ammunition to the kill teams in the army. We have a Judiciary with the Beacon Angelus, so we can put him in one of the Deathwatch kill teams, jump him in with a free rapid ingress, then heroically intervene and fight first into enemies that are trying to engage into the kill teams. We have a Combi Weapon Lieutenant, as well as a Watchmaster with the Thief of Secrets. What's interesting here is that the Watchmaster has taken the Thief, which improves his damage output in melee instead of the Gravis Captain. Oftentimes we see it with the Gravis Captain because he can take 2 weapons if he doesn't take his heavy bolt rifle, 2 melee weapons. He gets both an extra attack sword or fist, and as well as his normal, usually power fist. However, I imagine that the Gravis Captain's going to be on the table for the most part, so he wants to use the Tome of the Ectoclades more easily, whereas the Watchmaster will oftentimes begin the game inside a Rhino and won't be able to activate the Tome's ability. From there, we have 2 units of Deathwatch veterans. These have very slightly different loadouts. Both of them are equipping 4 Deathwatch Thunderhammers. However, one of them is equipping 1 each of the heavy weapons for the unit, a frag cannon and an Infernus heavy bolter. The other one is instead equipping 4 Astartes Storm Shields in addition to 4 power weapons. So one of them able to do a little bit more shooting damage. I imagine that's going to be the one that attaches the Watchmaster, since his unit is going to be able to advance, shoot, and charge, whereas we want the higher melee damage output and increased resilience of the unit that is coming in with the Judiciary. For the backline, we also have an Intercessor Squad, as well as an Assault Jump Pack Intercessor Squad and an Invader ATV for some utility, and then a bunch of kill teams. There is a Desolator Squad in here as well to do some indirect fire damage. The nice thing here is that we can clear out enemy screening units, especially backline screens, in the early game to open up potential teleport sites for the kill teams later on, and then site-to-site teleport them to deliver them into those areas. However, we then also have a Deathwatch Terminator Squad. That's another good target for site-to-site teleport early. You can push them forward, use 3 Cyclone Missile Launchers to clear out other screening units, and then force your opponent to counterattack them, so you can open up good drops for the Indomitor kill teams. And then, speaking of which, we have 2 Indomitor kill teams to back that up as well. Last but certainly not least, a Rhino to carry around the Watchmaster's unit on top of that. So, much greater focus on Deathwatch veterans in this build than we typically see. Oftentimes, we're seeing a lower number of those veteran squads for more Indomitor or Fortis kill teams, but in this case, we're going to be taking a lot of that reactive melee play with a long threat range melee threat on the Deathwatch veteran Watchmaster unit, as well as the rapid ingress threat off the Judiciary's unit. That's going to be backing up those Indomitor kill teams rather than the increased indirect or long range fire, which is cool. A little bit more well-rounded of a build than we will often see from the more Fortis kill team based variants. Now we're going to return to the 4th Iberian Ham to talk about our last Space Marine chapter of the week, that being Blood Angels. This was taken to a 5-0 record to take 2nd place in the event by Manel Tula, who was running a Rage-Cursed Onslaught list. Now the interesting thing about this list is that it focused extremely heavily on Death Company squads, so we don't necessarily need a lot of use out of Oath of Moment because most of the army is going to have hit rerolls baked in. However, it doesn't have a lot of characters to attach into them. So oftentimes we will see a ton of characters like captains, Death Company captains, or chaplains to attach into these smaller units like Sanguinary Guard or Death Company Marines. We aren't seeing that in this case. Instead, what we have is a foot chaplain with Master of the Red Thirst to grant fights first once per game. This guy can attach into the foot Death Company Marine squad to give them their +1 to wounds, as well as get that fight first. So even if they're holding down an objective, they do gain additional power when you destroy models out of the unit, and then they're going to be able to fight first into you, so they can receive charges and incoming attacks pretty well. We then also see a jump pack captain with Sanguinary Tier. That's to grant +1 strength to Death Company units within 6 inches of the bearer. So that will include not only his unit, and this guy will attach into one of the jump pack Death Company squads, but he's also going to be pumping up a lot of the other Death Company profiles. Now from there, we also have Lamarties, who can reduce the incoming damage on one of the jump pack Death Company units as well, but that is all the characters, no more. We do have an Intercessor squad for the backline, a Death Company Dreadnought. This guy can use the Insensate Rampage stratagem to get a 5+ feel no pain, so he's actually very difficult to kill in this detachment. And then, as I mentioned before, 3 units of jump pack Death Company Marines, as well as a unit of foot Death Company Marines. Those guys all equipped with bolt pistols, chainswords, as well as a couple of eviscerators. We have a single Eradicator squad for some anti-vehicle, as well as an Outrider squad with 3 Outriders. These guys will combo the bonus attacks that they get from the detachment ability with their own charge bonus of additional strength and damage, so they can hit fairly hard when they get in. And then we have the obligatory, at this point, 3 units of 3 Sanguinary Guard squads for trading pieces. Those guys are all equipped with banners and spears, as well as a scout squad for some additional utility. So tons and tons of trading units. We just have basically this endless just wave of jump pack melee units descending on you. 30 jump pack Death Company plus 9 jump pack Sanguinary Guard plus the additional utility units and the 10 Death Company Marines and the Dreadnought on the table that are just going to be able to overwhelm you. A lot of those are also going to get that +1 strength bonus from the Sanguinary tier aura effect. Pretty interesting build. Not too far from the beaten path of a lot of the Rage Cursed Onslaughts that we've seen previously, although definitely not focusing on any of the characters like Commander Dante, for example, or jump pack captains is very different. Now with that, we'll move over to some Xenos factions and begin by discussing the Leagues of Votann, which took down the Glasshammer GT January. This was won by Alex Gins, who took it down with a Hearthband detachment, rocking a trio of calls, one of them equipped with the Bastion Shield, and one of them with the Iron Skein enhancement to give him additional wounds. Bastion Shield giving an Armor of Contempt effect against enemies nearby, an aura that you can expand by spending yield points on him. We have a Memnir Strategist to generate those yield points, as well as Uthar the Destined, a single unit of Hearthkin Warriors with the Sagittar to split them into 2 units of 5. So we have an attachment option for Uthar, as well as a protector for the backline, plus a utility unit that can push forward with the Sagittar. We then have similarly a Capricus Carrier, as well as a unit of Hernkin Pioneers to split into that one. We have 2 units of 3 Brokir Thunderkin, 2 units of 5 Chthonian Berserks, as well as 3 units of Einhir Hearthguard, a total of 25, 2 units of 10 and a unit of 5. From there, we have some offensive disruption pieces in the form of 3 Hernkin Pioneers to flip control of objectives in the early game. Then we can drop down and clear out some screens with the combination of the Pioneers as well as the Einhir, the smaller Einhir Hearthguard unit. That, once your opponent comes out to deal with those, will open you up for good positions to rapid ingress the larger Einhir Hearthguard units and counterattack with all of the massive buffs that a Hearthguard can provide to those Einhir Hearthguard units in particular. We've actually seen a couple lists very similar to this do fairly well over the last week or so with Hearthband, so it's cool to see it continuing its success. Now with that, we're moving on to the largest event of the weekend, the Warhammer 40,000 Open Palm Springs, which was won by Durante Bocini, also known as Glynaceer, who won it with Tau Empire. This was a Montcad detachment, which we've been seeing gaining popularity, which we've been seeing skyrocketing in popularity due to the fact that it is most effective in the early game. It gives you good first turn plays. It gives you good control over lines of sight, thanks to the fact that it's very fast. And the turns where you need it to deal the most damage, turns 1, 2, and 3, that's when its abilities trigger. It doesn't give you more damage towards the late game like Cao Yan does, where it's not necessarily quite as useful because a lot of your early game units have already been killed. If you aren't able to screen this army out extremely well, it's going to be able to push directly into your front line and hold you off of objectives for the majority of the game. This is being led by Commander Shadowsun as the only character. We have a single Breacher team with a Devilfish. The Devilfish can disembark units after it advances, so he can auto 6-inch the Devilfish, push forward into the center of the table, disembark the Breacher team to get a long-range alpha strike. We have a Ghost Kill battlesuit to hold down the center of the table, a Hammerhead gunship for some dedicated anti-heavy target shooting with that big D6+6 damage devastating weapon as a bit of a late game piece. It's equipped with a railgun. We have a Kroot Carnivore unit for objective secured, in addition to a pair of Pathfinder teams. Both Pathfinder teams are being equipped with recon drones, so these are both going to be able to both infiltrate and scout, so they can deploy up in the center of the table, prevent enemies from deploying up there, and that opens up your capacity to scout forward, either with the crude carnivores or with your piranhas to get even stronger alpha strike. Plus, the Pathfinder teams can then advance even farther forward. They have 3 ion rifles, so they can do some not insignificant damage with their early game shooting into units they can get line of sight to, but then they can also act as spotters for your turn 1 attacks. We have 2 piranhas with fusion blasters, in addition to a trio of Riptide battlesuits and a Skyray gunship for long-range shooting, additional spotting provided by 2 stealth battlesuit teams, as well as a Vespid Stingwing squad. What is cool is that we see the return of the Breacher team. It's actually been a little while since we've had that unit in play. A lot of times what has happened is that we had a Grav Inhibitor drone Pathfinder team that would scout up the turn 1 Devilfish to be able to push that unit in the early game, but the Pathfinders unfortunately don't do as much damage as the Breachers, so while they do give it that scout, so their threat range is technically a little bit longer, they aren't delivering as frightening of a unit as the whole Breacher team with lethal hits and, ballistic skill 2 once they get guided for being able to push that threat range 18 inches up. You can push it even farther if you have a Strike Swiftly character in the army with the enhancement to give scout. However, we don't have any of those. We just have Shadow Sun, so we're not going to be using it. But we can use Shadow Sun to potentially regenerate CP off of the Auto 6 advanced stratagem on turn 1. So we can alpha strike with either Riptide battlesuits or the Devilfish pretty easily in most deployments. Chapter approved 2025. Now, going back to some Imperium factions, let's talk about Astra Militarum, who took down the Hammer in the New Year event. Scott Horus Heresy took this one down with basically just a bunch of Rogal Dorns in a big stack trundling up the table. His army included 2 Rogal Dorn tank commanders, as well as Ursula Creed and a unit of Gaunt's Ghosts. We do have a Cadian Shock Trooper squad. However, it's important to note that we did not have any Cadian command squad for the Shock Troopers to join into, so Ursula Creed was operating without the use of a Master Vox, so she wasn't able to project her infantry orders out too far. That said, she is still going to give regiment units a command point cost reduction. This is especially useful for discounting fields of fire. She can simply choose a random regiment unit nearby herself, and then also one of the Rogal Dorns to improve the Rogal Dorn's AP by 1 and discount the cost of that particular stratagem. On top of that, we have a pair of Toroxes as well as 3 Khazarkan squads, so we have 3 scouting units to hop into those Toroxes and push forward. We then also have reinforcements, which is another potentially infantry, which is another regiment targeting stratagem that we could potentially be discounting with Ursula Creed to regenerate those Khazarkan once they are destroyed. So we still have the early game push from the Khazarkan plus the Torox combos. We can use our Rogal Dorn tank commanders to buff those Toroxes up with additional movement from move. And then once the Khazarkan disembark, we can drop orders on themselves with Warrior Elite. In addition, we have Gaunt's Ghosts, who can also use their reposition effect to drop next to the Khazarkan once they disembark to then apply additional orders on top of them. So we can use things like first rank fire, second rank fire, plus the +1 to hit from Take Aim. In addition to that, we have a pair of Scout Sentinels that grant hit rerolls. These are also regiment keyworded, so we could, if we don't want to regenerate any Khazarkan units, we could even respawn a Sentinel. And last, but certainly not least, another pair of Rogal Dorn tank commanders. So we're basically running the 3 Khazarkan squads to dominate the battlefield in the early game, and then just trundling 4 Rogal Dorns down the battlefield, shooting at people for the remainder of the game. The nice thing is that in combined arms, we are able to get that +1 AP, which is huge for the relatively mid AP Rogal Dorn cannons, but you also get lethal hits when targeting opposing monsters and vehicles with the Rogal Dorns, which is especially good for their multi-melta sponsons. We're running melta guns and multi-meltas on these Rogal Dorns. Those are relatively mid-strength anti-tank weapons, only strength 9, so shooting at a lot of higher toughness targets, getting up to 6 melta shots with lethal hits allows you to convert those much more consistently, which is a huge benefit in a Rogal Dorn v Rogal Dorn match. Now, moving on from there, we are going to Chaos Demons at the Akron Brew Brawl Winter GT. This was won by Jeff Perry, running Scintillating Legion, unsurprisingly, and this is a fairly straightforward list. We did have the Blue Scribes in here to act as a nice little lone operative utility unit that can hop forward and hold an objective with impunity. On top of that, we also have Be'lakor, the Great Man himself, in addition to Kairos Fateweaver and 3 Lords of Change. One of them has Infernal Puppeteers to extend his range and line line of sight. One of them has the inescapable eye to provide additional flux tokens, so we can fuel both Pyrogenesis and Delirium Unmade to teleport Tzeentch demons around the battlefield and buff our attacks and power them up with flux tokens. On top of that, we have a ton of utility units, 3 units of flamers and 3 units of screamers, 3 models in each of those units. And that's it. That's the whole list. Pretty normal, scintillating Legion stuff that we've talked about a great deal over the last couple of weeks on the channel. Now, in a similar boat, we have Thousand Sons, another Tzeentch-aligned faction from the Skovda Battleforge 6, where they went undefeated with Johan Linston going 5-0 with the faction. Now, he did play second due to tiebreakers, putting Deathwatch in first place with an X and 1 record. However, Johan was undefeated from the event, and he was running Thousand Sons in a Grand Coven. This included a Demon Prince with wings with the Eldritch Vortex of Attack for additional strength and damage on his psychic weapons, so both his psychic power and melee attack, making him pretty good as a little bit of an alternative beatstick to Magnus, both at shooting and in melee. He can disrupt your backline pretty well with his 6-inch deep strike and additional sustained hits ability once per game. We have Magnus the Red, the Great Man himself, to siphon all your command points through and be an absolute powerhouse. 3 sorcerers, no enhancements on any of them whatsoever, and a Terminator sorcerer with the Umbralific Crystal to teleport around in your command phase. We then have 3 Rubric Marines to attach to the 3 sorcerers, relatively regular. We can take over the center of the table with Sekitar robots to act as utility and also push back enemy infiltrators. That's going to open up a lot of additional spaces for the Scarab Occult Terminator unit that's also in here. So there's 10 Scarab Occult Terminators, and those guys are going to be able to hop around in the early game with Umbralific Crystal to get an Alpha Strike on your opponent if the Sekitar robots are able to open up enough space for you to land. Otherwise, you can even deep strike those guys and then use the Umbralific Crystal to redeploy them other places on the table later on over the course of the game. So lots of optionality with that unit, extremely mobile. We then have a Fatecaster Greatbow Zangor Enlightened unit and a pair of Zangor units as utility. Pretty cool to see the Sekitar robots and mass Rubric Marines on the table. The Scarab Occult Terminators are always an interesting pick, and it's nice to see Thousand Sons doing well even after their many nerfs. Now, moving on, let's discuss Orks and the insane build that Mark Perry took to Coastal Assault to take down the event with a 5-0 record. This list was using the Mordaka detachment, the great fiend of yesterday's meta. This allows your units to gain assault on all your ranged weapons equipped by infantry, as well as sustained hits 1 on your ranged attacks during the shooting phase. Now, while there were a couple of units in here that were constructed to take advantage of this detachment ability, a lot of the power of this army is constructed around stratagems like Orks is still Orks to give you rerolls and targeting enemies on objectives, as well as Get Stuck In Lads, which allows you to duplicate the WOG effect on a specific unit for 2 command points. That allows this army to concentrate its buffs on specific units to get a lot of work out of them, while the rest of the massive horde of models absolutely overwhelms its opponent and gives it the greatest chance to win on scenario. Now, fortunately, I do have a game live streamed from Mark Perry using a similar version of this list. It was a little bit different and swapped out a couple of units from the Tennessee Elite Open that I streamed 2 weeks ago. So please go check that out. I will drop a link in the video description to that live stream if you are interested in watching Mark play Mordaka live on stream. However, getting stuck into the list itself, we have Boss Nikrod to act as a utility piece who can redeploy himself once you see your objectives in order to score them. We have Gazgul Thraka as well as Zodgrod Wartsnaga. The big benefit here is that Zodgrod's unit goes absolutely insane once the WOG is called on them, getting an automatic +6 to their movement characteristic and allowing them to then advance and charge and push up into the center of the battlefield. So he grants his Gretchen unit a scout 9 inches and then that additional 6 inches of movement if you pay 2 CP to get stuck in to gain the WOG bonus. And that lets this huge brick of Gretchen cross the middle of the table very easily, movement block your opponent, and steal their objectives away while being very difficult to kill. If you don't have good infantry sweeping in a lot of armies, they simply can't deal with this Gretchen unit that's -1 to wound and with a 5+ invulnerable save, and they will take so long to get rid of that the rest of the army has already obsect all the center of the table before you're able to kill it. We then have 6 units of 10 boys. These are equipped with a combination of Shootas and Sluggas. We've got 3 units with Sluggas and 3 units with Shootas to make a little bit of use of that Mordaka effect. In any case, these guys are still able to use Orks as still Orks to gain wound rerolls targeting enemies on an objective. They have OBSEC and high OC, so they're going to be able to lock down the center of the table in any space that is left behind from the Gretchen. We then have 3 units of commandos that can combat squad to absolutely absorb the entire middle of the table with tons and tons of units with their units of 5 orcs running around. We have a single smash-a-gun mecha gun, as well as 3 units of storm boys, so additional 5 model utility units, 3 units of 3 war bikers, additional utility units, and 1 unit of 6 mega knobs that's likely to attach in with Ghazghkull Thraka to actually deal the majority of damage from the army. So while the army in and of itself is just a massive number of units, you can individually knock down your opponent's utility. You're going to have a tough time clearing through heavy targets, but if you bog them down in enough individual units of orc boys, it's difficult for a single activation to actually deal enough damage for it to make that big of a difference. While you can swing up a little bit with rerolls from Orks to Still Orks, a lot of this army is just going to be bogging you down and out OCing you on objectives and absolutely zeroing out your score. And in some cases, it can even play fixed secondaries fairly well as well, using things like engage on all fronts and behind enemy lines with the massive numbers of models that it has, including units like Boss Necrot, who can immediately teleport into your opponent's deployment zone. So if it gets a beneficial deployment zone, it's going to be able to score very consistently, both on primary and secondary as well. While focusing on objective control rather than damage output feels like a very un-orky way to play, it does end up being a very orky style list, with just masses of idiots running across the table to steal your objectives out from under you. Now, with that, we are moving on over to the First Blood CDMX event, which was won by Adepta Sororitas, being piloted by Jaime Cruz, who took a Hallowed Martyrs detachment to the event. This is the index-style detachment, where you can regenerate your characters and gain bonuses when you are below your starting strength. This includes a Saintly Example Canoness to generate miracle dice when she dies, a Jump Back Canoness to deal some serious damage with Through Suffering Strength, a pair of Hospitallers, as well as Morven Vol, and a unit of Paragon Warsuits for her to jump into. We do have a pair of Celestian Sacrosanct units for those Hospitallers to hop into to regenerate models back into the unit. As you are taking casualties with them, it's very difficult to one-shot the unit because they have a -1 to wound effect, 4+ invulnerable save, and a feel no pain on top of that. And then you can regenerate back and gain +1 to hit if you don't regenerate all the way back to starting strength. In many cases, because you can regenerate so many models by burning miracle dice through the Hospitallers, you're able to recontrol objectives as well, giving this army some very solid midboard control. That is further supplemented by a pair of Immolators that can combat squad a selection of the Battle Sisters as well as Sister Novitiates to push them up the table as well and generate additional utility units, as well as get some multi-melta shooting in the center of the battlefield. Those Immolators were equipped with Flamers, however, we could use them to transport things like a Retributor squad that's equipped with multi-beltas, as well as the combat squad half of the Battle Sister squad up the table to do some damage. Last but certainly not least, we also have a Zephyrim and Seraphim squad to act as utility units. Now, moving on to the final list of the week, we are going to go to the Denver 40k Fight Club January Open, which was won by the Drukhari extraordinaire Cody Giroux, playing Spectacle of Spite. We've seen this detachment do incredibly well with varieties of lists that are either focusing on character-heavy combat versions or lighter, more infantry-focused versions that are focused more on scoring. In this case, we are taking 3 Succubi with each of the enhancements, one with Chrono Shard for Fights First, one with Morgana's Curse for additional damage, and one with Periopt of Torments, which prevents enemies from overwatching the Succubus's unit. We have Lilith Hesperex and Lady Malice in there as well. That's followed up by 4 units of Witches to attach with those characters. Those can embark into a combination of a Venom and 2 Raider squads. So we are going to be able to split one of those units into 2 units of 5, but the rest will have to exist in units of 10. We have a Chronos to regenerate pain tokens, as well as a total of 20 Hellions in 2 units of 5 and a unit of 10, plus a pair of Mandrake squads, 1 Reaver Jetbike squad, 3 units of Scourges with heavy weapons. 2 of those are equipped with Dark Lances for anti-tank, and 1 of them is equipped with Haywire Blasters to be more specifically anti-vehicle. A little bit lighter on the utility and things like the Hellions versus some other varieties we've seen, but we get much more work out of those high OC Witches and their attached characters in this variation. And with that, those are all the best armies in Warhammer 40k for this week. Thank you for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks to Ides of March for sponsoring this video. Please go check them out in the links in the video description and pinned comment. And thanks to everyone who supports Tactical Tortoise, whether that's over on Patreon at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise, as well as YouTube channel members. All of you are getting a bunch of additional exclusive videos this week, because not only did I release a couple of tactics videos that I'm going to release exclusively as patron and supporter videos, but I also did a couple of list tech videos that are going alongside some of the how to play videos for specific factions that I released earlier this month. Lots of content going on over there, which is cool. We also just had a bunch of games uploaded from top level players at the Tennessee Elite Open, and we'll have more of those next month as well. So lots of value from that membership. Huge thanks to all those people, as well as the people who subscribe to me over on Twitch to get early access to my stream VODs. All you people are amazing, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.